So it's 5:05. We're going to get rolling. Again, my name is Chase Scannell. I'm the Communications Director here at Conservation Northwest. Really excited to talk with you all about the Cascades to Olympics program. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you've all got your fair share of sun this week. Our panelists tonight are going to be Paula Swedin, our Policy Director who works out of Olympia and leads the Cascades to Olympics program, and Brian Stewart, who's our Cascades to Olympics Coordinator, has done a lot of research on habitat connectivity in this landscape and has done some real excellent work as a local resident and community member in terms of engaging with other residents and tribes, recreation groups, and others in the interest of both this program and community building across Southwest Washington. So just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we do have two additional staffers, Keiko and Jen, who are going to be operating the chat. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, or if you're having any issues, like you can't hear me or anything crashes, they will respond to you there, or they'll pass questions along to me and Paula and Brian. We'll do our best to answer a few of the questions during the main event after Brian and Paula both talk about their work, but we'll also save about 10 to 15 minutes at the very end specifically for questions. So if we don't get to your question, please just be patient, and I hope that we will get to it by the end of tonight's event. One more thing to be aware of, Brian has warned us that his internet may be a little bit spotty. We are really lucky to have him working on the ground in Southwest Washington and operating as a member of this community, but sometimes, you know, having folks out in the field comes with a little bit slower internet than, say, here in Seattle. So if you see Brian's video drop off, please don't worry. He'll be back shortly on audio, and we'll just roll with it if that happens. And let's see here. Anything else we need to cover now? I think that covers it. Again, we'll have this recording up on YouTube soon. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll save some time at the end specifically for a Q&A. We'll go ahead and move forward. As a few of you may know, the Cascades to Olympics program is one of our newer initiatives at Conservation Northwest. It really ramped up in 2018, and we started working on a few new projects in 2019. So one of our newer conservation programs, but this is a landscape where our organization has worked and had a presence for decades, and Paula will talk a little bit more about that shortly. We're really excited to see this program growing and finding opportunities at the local level and at the policy level to advance conservation objectives. The goal is really simple. We want to connect and restore habitat between two of Washington's largest wild areas, the Olympic Peninsula and the Cascade Mountains. A key stepping stone between those wild areas is the Willapa Hills of Southwest Washington. And if you look at the map that you can see here on the screen, there's a clear barrier between the Cascades and the Olympics, and that's the I-5 Valley. And we're looking at ways to allow animals like elk and deer and black bears, as well as critters like spotted owls and marbled murrelets, to cross that barrier. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. You know, I'm someone who has spent a ton of time in this landscape. I've got deep family roots in the Grays Harbor area and spent a lot of my childhood on the beaches of Hood Canal, fishing on the Chehalis River. I'm really excited to see Conservation Northwest get more engaged in Southwest Washington, both because it's just such a neat and fascinating landscape, but also because this work is so timely. All of you probably know that development and population growth are really increasing in the I-5 corridor from Seattle and Olympia all the way to Vancouver and Portland, Oregon. And this gives us a window of opportunity to get some of this conservation and connectivity work done in the Cascades to Olympics landscape now, before that opportunity is closed due to human development. And with that thought in mind, that timeliness of the Cascades to Olympics program, I want to welcome Paula Swedin and turn it over to her to talk in a little bit more depth about this program, how it fits in with Conservation Northwest work, and some of the things that she's working on in the Cascades to Olympics landscape.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and taking some time out of your day to learn more about our program. So as Chase introduced me, my name is Paula Swedin. I've been the Policy Director at Conservation Northwest for 3 years now, but my history goes back 30 years with the organization. And it also goes back 30 years to working on forest conservation and endangered species, especially spotted owls and marbled murrelets. So when we conceived of this program, it was near and dear to my heart because I've spent a lot of time as a wildlife biologist way back in my early years with the Forest Service and then DNR and Department of Fish and Wildlife, trying to figure out how to maintain populations of forest-related endangered species, especially owls and murrelets. And Southwest Washington is one of those places where it's extremely challenging to try to make that happen. It's just one example. And then more recently, over the last 6 years that I've been formally working for Conservation Northwest, I've been working on wolf conservation. And someday we have the dream of that critter making it across the Cascade crests, establishing itself in the southern Cascades in the mountains, and making it across Southwest Washington into the Olympics. That would be a lovely dream. But in order for that to happen, we really do need to establish habitat connectivity, both for things that fly and things that walk on four legs. So just so we're operating on the same understanding, I wanted to talk a little bit about what connectivity actually means for wildlife. So it's the ability of animals to find all the resources they need for feeding, breeding, and shelter across space and time. And that's both in the short term and the long term. And on much longer time scales, it's also about the ability of subpopulations to exchange individuals so they can maintain their population numbers through breeding. It's called demographic support. And then also to be able to exchange genetic material over multiple generations so those populations can stay resilient and adapt and evolve over time. Habitat loss and fragmentation create areas that can be dangerous to cross or too large to successfully locate the resources that animals need to live and breed. And so therefore, that's one of the biggest obstacles to landscape connectivity for wildlife. And then structures like highways and cities present higher risk of mortality to animals, both from getting hit by vehicles or being shot by people that don't want larger animals, especially carnivores, close to where they live. So those kinds of human imprints on the landscape can make it very difficult for large-scale landscape connectivity of the kind that we're hoping to restore in this landscape. Then lack of connectivity, especially over long periods of time, can ultimately lead to local and regional extirpation of these species and loss of ecosystem function. So as Chase mentioned, our Cascades to Olympics program is young, but our efforts to protect core areas and restore wildlife in the main wild areas of the Olympics and the Cascades have been ongoing for several decades. And so examples of some of that work, and if you were on the Forest Field Program webinar, you've heard a little bit of this before, but along with many partners, we've worked to end old growth logging on Forest Service and DNR lands in both the Olympics and Cascades. We helped put into place and continue to keep the Northwest Forest Plan intact. We're currently working very hard to restore forests and watersheds, the areas on federal lands and state lands that have been logged in the past, and working on taking out roads and eroded areas and restoring those. And then, as many of you probably know, we were instrumental in helping to get overpasses and underpasses on I-90 to allow wildlife to move north and south through the spine of the Cascades. And then we've also reintroduced the Pacific Fisher into both the Olympics and recently the North and South Cascades. So that's part of the wildlife restoration and being able to make sure that fishers can make it between both of those core populations will allow those populations will allow that species to thrive well into the future. So challenges to connectivity in this landscape over time. As I mentioned, habitat loss and fragmentation is a big one, and that's especially true in the Puget Sound lowlands and across Southwest Washington, where industrial logging and small forest landowner logging and farming are dominant uses of the landscape. And that's not to say that those aren't important contributions to our society and to our economy, but we're hoping to figure out ways that those land uses can be compatible with habitat restoration that's needed in the patterns that these critters need. Then obviously, oh, Chase, can you move on to the next slide?
Is this the slide you're looking for, Paula, or is there one after?
On that one, that's the one I'm looking for. Yeah. So, so you can see this is just an image taken off of Google Earth, and you can see from the southern end of Puget Sound down that pin is about where Centralia is. But so from the south part of Puget Sound, you know, all the way down to our border with Oregon. Sorry about that. You've got I-5 as a structure, and then a lot of development and non-green areas around it. And then from east to west, you've got the corridor from Highway 8 and Highway 12 out to the coast. And both of those highway and urban development areas can block movement of animals from both from the Cascades to the Olympics in east-west and north-south directions. So trying to figure out where the appropriate crossing structures are and how to get those structures in place is a big part of this program, and Brian's going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And then climate change is also a really big challenge to long-term connectivity. Can you go to the next slide? There we go. So this is just one of the more visual representations of the impacts of climate change on our region. So this is a picture of what used to be Anderson Glacier, and below that is Anderson Lake. And I was just up there, just took that picture on Sunday, and that Cirque Basin above the lake 100 years ago was absolutely full of ice. And in fact, the lake wasn't there or wasn't visible. By 1960, that glacier had retreated. It still filled most of that basin, but you could see the lake with the nose of the glacier was right at the end of the lake. In 1990, the nose of the glacier was above that big rock formation that's above the lake, but there was still a definable glacier. And now what you see is just sort of essentially remnant snow patches. So within many of our lifetimes, an entire glacier has disappeared, and that glacier is the headwater, or was the headwater of the Quinault River. So as temperatures warm and our streams and lakes warm up, and we lose essential sources of cold water for aquatic species, and also moisture for our forest ecosystems, and then vegetation structure changes and species change, animal populations, wildlife populations are going to have to adapt. And having broad movement corridors and many redundant interlocking patches of habitat are going to be really important for species to be able to survive over time. So I'm just going to spend another couple minutes to talk a little bit about the connectivity work that I've been involved in for quite a few years in this landscape, and that has to do with two important winged creatures in this area, so spotted owls and marble murrelets. And both of these species have suffered population declines, mainly driven by habitat loss and fragmentation. They both depend on structurally complex older forest and very large trees. And so, Chase, you can go to the next slide. And so here's an example of the kinds of structures. You need forests with lots and lots of trees like this. Again, I took this picture just a few days ago in the Upper Quinault. It's supposedly the largest western hemlock in Washington state. It measures over 10 feet in diameter and has these really large branching structures. And these kinds of trees are needed by both owls and murrelets. And Southwest Washington used to be full of trees like this. And we don't necessarily expect to get them back in a reasonable amount of time, but we can get trees that size anyway. But we can get forests that have trees that are big enough to over 20 inches in diameter, and size variation, and sorry about that, complexity in terms of the horizontal structure as well. So some open patches and closed patches and lots of understory species diversity, and snags and downwood. And that kind of ecosystem supports flying squirrels and wood rats and other critters that owls need. And it also has the nesting structures that marble murrelets need. There we go, great picture of marble murrelets. So we have been working for quite a few years to work with private landowners to create financial incentives and regulatory incentives in order to encourage them to grow older forest again. And while that's long and hard work, and we're nowhere near done, we have a good start for trying to be able to get enough habitat back in this landscape for both of those species to survive. For marble murrelets, we've also been spending a lot of time working with the Department of Natural Resources to try to get them to conserve, first to get them to conserve adequate habitat in their recent update to their federal habitat conservation plan, and now also to voluntarily conserve additional habitat on top of that. And that work is also ongoing and involves solving some tricky social issues, because logging on those lands pays for schools and county services. And so we have to figure out a way to make sure rural communities can thrive while we're also trying to conserve this habitat. So that's just a flavor of what we're doing there. And I want to pass it off to Brian now, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about the connectivity research he's been doing across I-5 and mapping out where the corridors need to be.
Thanks, Paula. Before we turn it over, Brian, I just want to remind folks we've got two staffers, Keiko and Jen, operating the chat and Q&A function. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them either now or in the questions at the end. And then just, as you can see here, here's another critter that is really important in the Cascades to Olympics landscape, Roosevelt elk. And I think Brian will talk a little bit about elk and black bears and other terrestrial wildlife that are trying to move through this landscape. Brian, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chase. And thanks everyone for being here. I love talking about this stuff. Can we go back to the program map before we get started here, just so everyone has that in their mind? I've been introduced, Brian Stewart, a Cascades to Olympics program coordinator. This has been touched on, but I kind of will reiterate that, you know, development and land use in this area has severely fragmented key habitat types. And in this landscape, when we say habitat type, we're talking marine to estuary to river to riparian to wetland to prairie to oak, woodland prairies. We have so many in such a diverse landscape that, you know, fragmentation can really hurt the processes that make these habitat types possible. So I'll kind of get right into, Paula had mentioned I-5, and I've got a lot to talk about I-5, because as you can see on that map, it is a major fracture point and it's a bottleneck, and it's why I focused my thesis research on I-5, was trying to discover what is the permeability, what is going on there, can species cross, is it impossible? And it's also a reason why this program in Conservation Northwest continue to advocate for research and look at ways that we can get critters across that corridor. And I'm talking all types of critters. So, you know, not just elk, not just bear, but everything that needs to move. How do we get them from one side of that thing to the other? So one of the things we did was we wanted to evaluate, you know, passage assessment. The passages, we wanted to evaluate passage assessments at structures. So what structures in I-5 are already good or could be made better? And so we used a WashDOT tool called the Passage Assessment System. And we went in and looked at many, many structures, large viaducts and underpasses. And we ranked them based on their shape, their size, what they're made of, what the human presence is like, and took those data points and thought about them in the context of species needs. If an ungulate has a hard time with riprap, is that going to be an issue for it at this one? If it's a cover obligate and there's nothing to hide under, is that an issue? And we look at all these things and we rank those structures, and then we make recommendations based on those rankings. And, you know, surprisingly, there's actually about 16 structures on I-5 because they're large underpasses that with fencing and restoration could be decent. Of course, that takes, you know, some movement politically and of course funding, but yeah, what we found over and over was that fencing and restoration were issues at just about every structure that a critter might cross under. Another step we did to look at the layers of issues here is we did an analysis on roadkill and collision data, data we got from WashDOT. And, you know, without getting boring into the scientific details, two things kind of came out of looking at that data. One, we found that the structures like at the Newaukum River and the Skookumchuck River in the Chehalis basin actually had the highest rates of structures, highest rates of collisions of all the structures we looked at in Southwest Washington on I-5. And the second thing we discovered, which was sort of an oddity, was that wildlife vehicle collisions and roadkill tend to be higher at large underpasses and viaducts. And at first that doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you think about it, these locations don't have fencing, you don't have wildlife infrastructure there. And so if an animal's getting habituated, you can hypothesize that if they're spooked or they're doing grazing, they could end up on the freeway because there's no associated fencing to keep them off of there. And, you know, I-5 is sort of a death trap for some of these creatures. So That was another analysis we looked at. And then we overlaid all that stuff we found with GIS maps of habitat connectivity models. And I don't want to get in that too much, but the maps we used were developed by the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also the Washington State Department of Transportation. And what we found is after overlaying the data, where do things line up, where do maps line up with collisions, etc., we found a handful of priorities, and the program map kind of shows those 1, 2, 3, and I'll talk a little bit about them. The first thing we found was that structures like the Newaukum and Skookumchuck, because of their high rates of collisions and because of their location in sort of a really highly developing area in the basin, are really key linkages that we're kind of calling those the middle linkages. And we really need to get wildlife infrastructure out of those things. And so one of the things we're doing hopefully next summer is a volunteer restoration and cleanup project at the Newaukum. And then also at Satsup River on 12, which I'll talk about in a second. And we're actively seeking ways to kind of, you know, make these structures more permeable and attractive to wildlife. Another thing we found was that between north of the Tula River and south of the Cowlitz River, there's a large location where wildlife, a potential wildlife bridge could go. It's got connectivity there, it's got collisions there, and so that's another area we're looking at. And another area that came up, the one on our program map, is what we're calling northern linkage, and it's really a stepping stone mosaic of DFW land, of private nonprofit land. Veterans Ecological Trades Collective is one of the groups that holds a large piece of land on I-5. Chehalis is native to this area, the tribes I should say, and their land and their sort of partnership would be super important because this is their cultural landscape, and it's something we're working on and trying to develop this. And then of course DFW has a bunch of properties in this area, and we really feel that if we can work together with these different groups, we might be able to string something together for birds and critters that walk on all four. And that's kind of called the northern linkage. And then we did discover a couple of locations like Owl Creek, which is very, very south of everything I've talked about. But, you know, it's got a convergence of ungulate least cost paths, natural linkage paths, and collisions that make it an interesting spot. But there are some serious land use issues around it. You know, ultimately, we're just beginning to really try to reach out on the ground and build partnerships and relationships to make these things tangible projects. But I think we're in the right space, and because time's slipping away with climate change and development, I think it's like Chase said, that this is very timely, and so that we're in that arena and we're working on those things now. And so I'll kind of move on to some of the other stuff we're doing, and this map's been coming up, and maybe if Chase can go to the natural linkage map with all the blue lines, we'll talk a little about that. So another thing we're doing in this landscape is working with groups like the Washington Habitat Connectivity Working Group, which works and has worked on for many, many years on, you know, doing connectivity models, statewide analysis, Columbia Plateau. We've been doing it since 2010. You can check them out at waconnected.org. Really great group. And they've been sort of brought into the fold by another cool group, Cascades to Coast Landscapes Collaborative, who is, you know, a group that's working on bringing stakeholders and landowners together and using sort of scientific GIS products to find overlap with things like working lands, ecosystem services, and connectivity is one of their things. And so they brought together Connectivity Working Group, and they started producing things like what you see on your map on the screen there. That map there is a map of natural linkages. And so basically what you're looking at is the really light blue are the centroids of those corridors, so the least cost paths, connecting protected areas. This is not for a particular species, I should mention. This is essentially the most natural areas that connect to protected areas. As complicated as that sounds, that's what that is. And so this is the first output that they did, and we're using that now because for generalists like deer, these are very apt proxies to use when we're thinking about how they move through the landscape. I should also say that if you want to check out the work that the Cascades of Coast Landscapes Collaborative is doing, ctoclc.org is where they're at, and you can actually access these maps we're looking at now and play with them, and there's interactive and you can download them, so I highly recommend checking it out. The other part of that project, though, is mapping for species, so beaver, mountain beaver, cougar, which there's some overlap with Panthera. I think Mark Albrock is on that, from Panthera, is on that cougar team, fisher, and western gray squirrel. So those are coming out in the months ahead. This map is already out now. And as they come out, they're going to be really key, I think, fisher, cougar, beaver, for us to get a really good sense of species-specific needs in this landscape. But until then, we have these maps, and these are really great maps, especially if you're just interested, like, where does my property sit on in this landscape, or you know, what areas should I be looking at if I'm thinking about connectivity? So I think those are great maps for that. I would also say that if you get a chance to go play on Data Basin, you can create an account, and there's a link to that on that Cascades to Coast Landscape Collaborative webpage. I highly suggest doing it, and maybe not just because I'm a nerd and love doing that, but because it's just really super informative. Another thing we're working on, because as you can see from these maps you're looking at, is that 12 and 101 and 8 really cut off the Olympic range from the Chehalis Basin. And this is super important, the Shasta River, the Wainuchi River, the riparian corridors that are associated with them, because they really move processes into the basin. And so we're beginning to do a report similar to what we did on I-5, looking at the convergence of these highways, right? US 101, US 12, and State Route 8 all converge and create sort of this really nasty barrier. And unlike I-5, there's far fewer large underpasses and viaducts. And so we have to be much more sort of surgical as we go in and look at where there are opportunities for crossing structures. And so we will be employing a lot of the same methods. We'll be looking at habitat linkage modeling. We'll be looking at roadkill data. In fact, some of the preliminary data that we've already got has us and the habitat connectivity biologist at Washington State Department of Transportation looking at Satsup River, which is another one of those places, like I said, next summer, we're gonna probably set up a volunteer crew and get the invasives out, maybe do some planting and get the garbage cleaned up, because right now as they sit, they're pretty trashed. And if we can improve them in any way, or even just bringing awareness as we work on them for the corridor that's attached to them is good. So I think that's key. And then also that region, you know, I talked about the northern linkage, which would include places like Capitol Forest and those places sort of south of that convergence of highways. But if that's going to be a possibility, really getting a northern linkage, then we're going to have to look at these roadways, these linear barriers, and address them, or that linkage won't be very great if it can't get into the Olympics. And it should be noted that it's essential that the processes from the Olympics make it to the Chehalis Basin, make it to the ocean, and that's true for the Willapa Hills, and it's true for the Cascades, because we're talking about ecological processes. And so we're not always talking about necessarily wildlife habitat connectivity. Some of what we're talking about in this landscape is really ecological connectivity. And so these roads also block processes, not just animals, but the processes that support animals and aquatic species and you know, all those things. And so I think with that, that's a really good short run-up intro into what we're doing down here, and I'll turn it back to Chase.
Thanks, Brian. Before we move on, we're going to talk about a few other the current issues in the Cascades to Olympics landscape, including the proposed Chehalis Dam and some of the Chehalis watershed work that a number of different state and federal and local nonprofit tribal entities are all working on. But before I get to that, I keep coming back to this photo because I think it's a really great example of some of the work that Paula and Brian have been doing. This is the Newaukum River, and it's one of the roads that goes over the Newaukum. You can see here that there is some wildlife connectivity already under this road because of this riparian area in this bridge. Now, a lot of what Paula and Brian are proposing is working with state agencies, working with tribes, hopefully once the pandemic is over, working with some of our volunteers to go in and clear out some of this brush, expand these existing undercrossings so that they allow for greater movement of wildlife, everything from elk, as Brian mentioned, down to some of the smaller mammals and reptiles, and even plants and those ecological processes that Brian was talking about. You know, this is really a landscape of stepping stones, and there are currently some stepping stones in the Cascades to Olympics landscape under I-5 and under Highway 12, which stretches from Olympia to Aberdeen, and under other roadways in the area to allow for wildlife movement. We want to improve those connectivity points, perhaps bring in some more undercrossings, particularly on I-5, and restore the habitat around them so that we can better allow for wildlife use in this landscape into the future, particularly given the long-term development trends in the I-5 corridor. So I think this photo of the New Whatcom River is a really great example, and there are literally dozens of other opportunities like this in the area that we want to work to improve and restore. And then we did have one question here that I think that relates to, which is about highway overpasses. And as many of you probably know, for decades we've worked successfully with the Washington State Department of Transportation, the U.S. Forest Service, other conservation groups and partners to bring about wildlife crossings on I-90 near Snoqualmie Pass, including that just amazing wildlife bridge that you may have seen if you've driven I-90 recently. And actually there will be another wildlife bridge under construction very soon. And we have seen hundreds of uses of those crossings by elk and coyotes, and literally over 1,000 uses by mule deer at this point. So we know that they're successful. We're really excited about the success of that project and being able to use that momentum for other places like I-5 in the Cascades to Olympics landscape, as well as up in the Okanagan area with our Safe Passage 97 project. But at least at this point, our understanding is that wildlife overcrossings are probably not a solution on I-5. They're just going to be too expensive. The highway is too big. The area is too developed. But again, there is existing connectivity in some of these existing bridges, and there may be opportunities with Interstate 5 to allow for additional undercrossings in the future. And those will be things that we'll be certainly studying and advocating for as those opportunities arise. But just don't be expecting any big undercrossings or overcrossings over I-5 anytime soon. But if we can have a network of undercrossings and expanded bridges like this one on the New Whatcom River, that could achieve the same goal. Brian or Paula, anything to add to that or anything else to touch on before we move on to some of the other work we're doing in this landscape?
I like to piggyback on what you're saying. And go ahead, Paula.
No, you go ahead, Brian. You're fine.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, there may be an opportunity for wildlife crossing structures. I don't want to say like, yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's a major challenge. It's a tough nut to crack. But there are some locations where it certainly is possible. Obviously, the money's not raining out of the sky or anything like that. But I would not take it off the table as sort of a pie in the sky aspiration.
It's good to point out that I-5 isn't the only highway in this landscape. You know, you've also got Highway 12 and some of the other smaller roads. So there's a suite of tools that we may be able to apply across this area.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say I agree that yes, they're expensive. I mean, ballpark for an overpass over I-5, we've heard somewhere in the $9 to $12 million range. But these are interesting times that we live in, and if an overpass indeed, say in that southern linkage area, is the only way we can get critters across, and there's social agreement that it's a good thing to do, it might be in these sort of big spending stimulus days, and the fact that we're starting to see language about connectivity come up in federal bills, and that more and more folks in Congress, if you take a look at the congressional committees on climate change, they're recognizing the need for landscape connectivity and for crossing structures. So it's not completely out of the question or inconceivable that we could say sometime in the next 10 years get funding for maybe one overpass over I-5.
That's great. Thank you both. I'm excited about the optimism there. And we got one more question here about wildlife migration routes and corridors, and you know, what are the historical migration routes in the Cascades to Olympics landscape, and then also potentially how those are looking today. And the short answer to that is what you see in this here map. We have, through Brian and Paula's research and some of the data analysis that we showed earlier, we have identified 3 primary wildlife corridors across I-5 and from the Central Cascades and South Cascades to the Willapa Hills, and then to the north across Highway 12 into the Olympic Peninsula, Olympic National Forest, and eventually Olympic National Park. anything else, Brian and Paul, that you want to say about these 3 priorities before we move ahead? All right, well, thank you for that. And one other piece in the chat was asking about partnerships, particularly land trusts. And I think we might get into that a little bit here shortly as we talk about the Chehalis Dam and all of the different partners that we've been working with on this landscape. But land trust is another one that we'll certainly be looking into. And as this program ramps up over the coming years, we certainly welcome new partners and also support from our members and donors. And a little bit further back in the chat, someone had asked about financial support. And I just want to say that while we're going to be working with the state and the state legislature and the Department of Transportation to secure public funding for these projects, support from our members and donors is essential to make this work possible. All of this research and science to date, our work implementing it, Paula's work in Olympia and Brian's work on the ground, all of that requires the support of our members, our donors, foundations. So if you feel compelled to do so, particularly in these somewhat unprecedented times where financial futures, especially for nonprofits like us, are uncertain, please consider making a donation or renewing your membership to support this program. It's really exciting and timely work, and we can't do it without your donations. So thank you. We're going to move ahead and talk a little bit about the Chehalis Basin, the proposal for a massive dam in the headwaters of the Chehalis River, something that has surprised a lot of people in this era where Washington State is receiving international acclaim for tearing down dams to restore fish passage. There's actually been a proposal to build a new one. And then there's been some news on that lately with the governor just last week weighing in and putting the brakes on that dam proposal and calling for a non-dam alternative to reduce flood impacts and restore fish habitat in the Chehalis Basin. And obviously we're very excited about that. So Brian, could you give us an overview of some of your work with the Chehalis River Alliance and the Chehalis Basin Strategy?
Sure. So I think the first thing we should say is that it's important to keep in mind that the Chehalis River Dam is really part of the Chehalis Basin Strategy. You think you can check that out at chehalisbasinstrategy.com. But it's part of a 3-prong effort, right, which includes an aquatic species restoration plan, which is really cool, and CFAR, Community Flood Assistance Resilience Program, which is also really cool. And so I just want to make clear as we talk about this that we may be skeptical of a dam, but we really do support those other efforts that this strategy has come up with. So yeah, I've been on the ground attending meetings at the Basin Board and getting to know folks there for, since late 2018 or early 2019. And I have recently in the last year started working with the Chehalis River Alliance, which is just this amazing group of conservation groups, recreation groups, tribes, individuals, retired folks, just a huge spectrum of people that are really interested in the health and well-being and resiliency of the Chehalis Basin. There's that picture, the artist rendition is pretty cool. Anyways, but yeah, that's a picture of it there. And we've been working pretty diligently to, go through the process of the draft environmental impact statement, write letters when we saw deficiencies in it, and, really support the Quinault and the Chehalis as they, do the heavy lifting, and we kind of come in and support that and do whatever we can to facilitate any gaps that might get missed. But really, it's been just a really amazing coalition of organizations. And frankly, we're all really happy about what the governor just did. And we probably all owe him a huge thanks because, he really went in and supported the tribes, supported what they had been saying and kind of towed that line. And then gave them room. Part of his letter was to say, hey, you need to engage the tribal communities better, the indigenous peoples of these areas. If they have concerns, we definitely need to be listening. So, yeah, I think that's the short end of what's going on right now. The work, it varies from us doing technical stuff to doing advocacy, to doing action alerts, to just informing the other groups in the Alliance of what's going on and keeping everyone up to date. And so I think that's a pretty good overview of what's going on with just the Alliance.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the fish impacts from this proposal and then turn it back over to you to talk about why this would be such a big deal for wildlife and why this exact site that you can see on the map here where the proposed dam would go would be an issue for wildlife. And then also about the parallel aquatic species restoration plan, which we see a lot of opportunity in as not only an alternative to the dam, but as a way to restore watersheds and wetlands and habitat across this region. But before we get to that, I'm going to go back to this slide about the proposed Chehalis Dam. And this is a graphic that some of the proponents from the local flood control district commissioned. This is a project that I've been following and working with Paula and other partners on for a little over 5 years now. As I mentioned, I do a lot of fishing in the Chehalis Basin on rivers like the Chehalis and the Wainuchi. This is an area that's really near and dear to my heart, and I spent a lot of time on the water here. And when this started to make the rounds among our conservation community, as well as with river advocates and recreationists, fish conservationists, everyone's eyebrows went up. There has never been a proposal quite like this, as far as we know, that has been successful. Some of the proponents were claiming, and you can actually see it here in this graphic, that this dam would be temporary and it would only be used in severe floods, that it would allow fish passage. Those are great claims, but they don't pan out in reality. As soon as this dam would be employed the first time, you would have that 700 acres of forest flooded, that habitat that has been shown by multiple studies to be critical for Chinook salmon, steelhead, Washington state fish, coho salmon, all use this reach of the Chehalis River for spawning and rearing. And while the dam proponents claim that fish passage would be part of the project, that's far from certain. And as soon as the dam is used once, much of that habitat is destroyed. Here's a look at the proposed dam site. Really a wild stretch of river that we think is the last place we want to see a new dam, especially again in this time when Washington is tearing down outdated dams to restore fish passage and really restore whole ecosystems. Some of these photos, I just want to say, are courtesy of our friend Shane Anderson, who works over at Pacific Rivers. And Shane has put together a fantastic documentary. It's about 60 minutes long. It's called Chehalis, A Watershed Moment. It was available online for a while, but now it is actually premiering on PBS stations around the region in August. It'll be on KCTS 9 if that's your local station. If not, check your local PBS listing and stay tuned for this documentary. It really is an exceptional product that Shane put together. It talks about the Chehalis Dam proposal, but also the larger story in this landscape of climate change and the impacts of forestry and all the people that are both disagreeing but working together at the same time to find a new future for the Chehalis that supports fish recovery, minimizes the effects of flooding, and really forges a new model for conservation in the 21st century. It's definitely worth checking out, and thank you, Shane, for the photos. One more photo here. This is another photo of the dam site that I took on a tour a few years ago, and just a little personal story about this trip. While we were out there at this site, some of the contractors that were employed by the local flood control board were presenting on the dam, and you can see their poster board there and talking about how the impacts on fish and wildlife could be mitigated. And while they were doing that, myself and I was standing next to a member of the Chehalis tribe. Both of us perked up at the same time, and you could hear behind us an elk bugling just a few hundred yards away, just upstream of the proposed dam site, within those 700 acres of forest that would be logged and flooded and destroyed from the dam. And it was just one of those things of, here you had a proponent talking about how the dam wouldn't be a big deal, and right behind them there's elk that are relying on this habitat for their home. It's one of those things that really you take away as you work on a project like this. One more thing about the Chehalis Dam, again, is the use of fish. And here we have, it looks like a Chinook salmon using this exact same reach of river where the dam would be built. It's a pretty concerning proposal from a variety of angles. It would have a big impact on fish as well as boaters and other recreationists who use this stretch of river. And it would also have a big impact on wildlife as a barrier for connectivity in this landscape. And I want to turn it back over to Brian to talk a little bit more about why the Chehalis Dam would have an impact on wildlife.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so it's interesting because you look at the graphic and you're like, well, hey, that's not going to bother an elk, but actually, it actually is. It's like Chase said, the elk don't have a lot of opportunities left, and although those species like elk may be long-range species, it doesn't mean that they don't need these corridors for movement, right? These corridors act as highways, right? And not just highways, but climate refugia highways, right? They're cooler, they have microclimates. And so it's not just elk, right? It's every single species that moves through this landscape uses these corridors. Something like 80% of species, 85% of species in this state utilize these riparian corridors for one function of their life or another. And so this proposed structure goes right in a spot where, frankly, there's not a lot of those spots left in the landscape, and to be taking away from them, it seems almost silly. So it doesn't really matter if you're deer, if you're fish, right? Destroying that area and kind of removing the habitat behind the dam every time there's an inundation is reckless. It's going to do some serious damage. But more importantly, right, you're going to build this thing and it may not actually solve the problem it's supposed to solve. In fact, it's only supposed to reduce catastrophic flood levels. It's not supposed to, totally get rid of them. So I'm not sure that the trade-off is worth it. But yeah, overall, riparian corridors like the Chehalis River are key natural highways for not just ecological processes and wildlife, but everything that goes on in our environment, especially in this landscape. Back to you, Chase. Throw it back to you.
All right, thanks, Brian. And I'm just sending a little bit more information about that film, Chehalis, A Watershed Moment, on the chat. Again, it was online for a little bit during sort of an exclusive online screening because of the pandemic, and it will be on PBS stations around the region shortly. So it really is a great piece, well worth a watch, and takes a deep dive into both the Chehalis Dam proposal and the larger dynamics at play, including perspectives from local tribes, residents, farmers, and others. We as Conservation Northwest, and maybe Paula can talk more about this in a moment, as we work in this landscape, as Brian lives there, we want to find solutions that support local communities, landowners, agriculturalists, and others. We know that the dam, it's one idea that's been on the table. The science shows that not only will it impact fish and wildlife, but it would actually have marginal benefits for flood control too. We want to find more holistic solutions that can reduce flooding, can really help protect some of those communities, maybe even support them if there needs to be changes in terms of land ownership or where they're farming. We want to continue this conversation so that they can be supported as well as the fish and wildlife, and that's something that Brian and Paula have been working on. But in our eyes, that the dam is really not the answer here. Paula, anything else you want to say about that and your work in Olympia or with some of our partners in this basin to think about long-term land management, forestry, and other impacts?
Sure. I think, I think it's important to note that that while we oppose the dam, it's really important to pay attention to the concerns of the residents. And not everybody's of the same mind, but and I think the film that Chase was mentioning does a really good job of essentially eliciting the opinions of like sort of the full variety of folks who live in the basin and would be affected by a dam, either positively or negatively. But the EIS really made it clear that there will be irreparable ecosystem damage, and not all of the human residents of the Chehalis Basin will benefit from that. And so it's going to create essentially more inequality. And if there's anything I think we've learned in our work, and a lot of this learning has come from even working on wolves in eastern and northeastern Washington, is that you got to sit down and listen to people. And collaborative solutions take a lot of time, and folks need to sit down with each other and roll up their sleeves and figure out how to create long-term solutions that don't create more problems. And I think there's a lot of really smart people out there, a lot of landscape ecologists and fish biologists, and all of the residents who have lived, all the farmers and the foresters and the landowners and the business owners who've lived in that area their whole lives. I think everybody wants a solution that's going to that's going to be durable, and we just haven't found it yet. And so I think the groups that we are working with in the Alliance and folks that we haven't reached out to yet all need to be part of the conversation. And I think what the governor's done is allowed that conversation to continue. And I guess the last thing I'd say on that is that it's possible that more natural floodplain and ecosystem restoration solutions will have multiple benefits. So, restoring more forests to absorb more water also absorbs more carbon and also creates more wildlife habitat. In addition to making it much more likely that salmon populations will be able to survive the ravages of climate change in the future. I mean, those are the kinds of things we need to look at, and then thinking outside the box. Can we raise businesses instead of having them be flooded year after year and having to pay flood insurance? I mean, the list can go on, but I do think that if the community can come together and find synergistic solutions, there's a way for us to figure out how people, fish, and wildlife can all live together and figure out how to adapt to the floods instead of beating them back.
Thank you, Paula. And I do just want to extend one more thanks to the governor for weighing in on this. We want to see holistic solutions to flood reduction and habitat restoration, fish recovery in the Chehalis Basin, but in our view, that the dam is not the answer, and we think his letters last week are really helpful in trying to forge a better path forward. I'm going to go ahead and post a statement that we put out last week regarding those letters from the governor in the chat, and if you want to learn more about that, you can do so there. We're going to switch over to Q&A for a few more minutes. Please stick with us, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in tonight. I think we've answered most of the questions that I saw come in through the chat. One piece that we didn't quite get to is Jesse had asked she had said there are several wildlife species that are unique to the Olympic Peninsula. How will they be affected by wildlife connectivity? Brian or Paula, could you hit on that? Are there any critters that are really unique out here? I know Roosevelt elk are one. Is there another species that comes to your mind as far as really benefiting from wildlife connectivity in this landscape?
I think this is Brian. I think they all do. Fisher's one too in that landscape, cougar, and I think we might want to look at it differently in that they may not be unique, and that some of these populations have become unique because they've been fragmented into areas for so long that they've become subpopulations of other populations. And so I think part of it is not having unique species and having free movement of those species, unless of course their habitat limits their movement. And those are just my initial thoughts. Paula, you got anything?
Well, I think that for species that are really endemic to the Olympic Peninsula, that improving connectivity of animals that that cross over both shouldn't really have an effect unless those endemic species could be susceptible to predation or could be susceptible to unintentional impacts of corridors like invasive species. And so I think that's something that we'll just have to be really careful about, is screening for unintended consequences of having broader connectivity when we don't have pristine landscapes. So I think it's a really astute question. And honestly, I'm not sure that we fully know the answer to that. And I think it's something that all of the biologists and ecologists that are working on landscape connectivity in this area should be thinking about.
Thank you, Paula. Maybe there's another question here that relates to this. Could you talk briefly about climate projections and the importance of these corridors for adaptation? I know we touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation tonight, but anything else you want to add about the impacts of climate on this landscape and the way that connectivity will help mitigate those impacts for wildlife? And if not, that's
I would say, oh, no, I was going to say something real quick. I would say that specifics, for example, are access to climate refugia, right? As things get warmer, that includes aquatic and terrestrial species, and that requires movement, typically up in altitude. In this landscape, it also means higher precipitation rates. For some species, it could just be moving a little distance. It isn't supposed to get super, super hot in this location, but flooding and fires will become more prevalent. And so those are kind of things you got to look at, but really it's about giving access and maintaining access to species to be able to move to cooler areas when they need to drier areas when they need to. Some species need to move into the floodplain. Some species will need to move out of the floodplain. And so as wild and different and unpredictable as some of these climate change models can be, we do know that, adaptation and genetic movement, which is required for adapting to climate change, is facilitated through species movement through landscape. So I'd say that.
Thank you, Brian. We did have one more question related to spotted owls and marbled murrelets. And the question is whether current federal protections for these species are adequate for recovery. And I know that both of these are critters that have serious challenges in terms of their comeback, but we've been doing a lot of work on each of them. Paula, anything you want to add related to spotted owls and marbled murrelets, both the listing status and our work to support their habitat?
Yeah, sure. So I think that federal plans are doing just about as much as they possibly can for spotted owls and marbled murrelets. I mean, the most, if not all, of their core habitat areas have been protected under the Northwest Forest Plan. And there's work being done to try to restore places that could recover as habitat on federal lands. I think the state could step up, and the state has two roles. One is a land manager with its trust lands, and talking about DNR, and they've got some decent long-term management plans for spotted owls, and their new amendment for marbled murrelets leaves some things lacking, and we are definitely pressing on them to figure out ways to conserve more murrelet habitat. But then in a regulatory role, through the Forest Practices Board, there have been years worth of discussions, and this is where some of the incentives have come up. And I say this with all due respect to my colleagues that work at DNR, is I think they're not pressing hard enough to make sure that the systems are in place in order for us to be able to make progress there. So, but both of those species are in grave danger of extirpation from Washington State, and it's a really profound thing to contemplate that within the next 20, 30 years they could be gone. So we need to work fast and to press for these changes, and CNW is doing that as much as we can, as are many of our partner organizations.
All right, thank you so much, Paula. It's 6 o'clock and we're going to wrap up. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. Really appreciate it, especially on such a sunny day here in the Northwest. Thanks for everyone that asked questions, and thank you for both of our panelists for the hard work that they're doing in this important landscape. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is really a program that's still growing, and we have big goals for improving habitat and connectivity in the Cascades to Olympics landscape. So you'll be hearing a lot more about this work this year and into the future. And for the upcoming, or for next month, our next Zoom event, we're going to talk about our Sagelands Heritage Program in Central Washington and the Safe Passage 97 project up in the Okanagan Valley, and some of our work there to build and renovate wildlife undercrossings and help connect habitat for mule deer, Canada lynx, and other species, which is just meeting a big milestone this month in the first private phase that many of you helped fund. And we'll talk more about that at our next event in late August. So please look forward to that over email and our social media in the weeks ahead. Thank you all for joining us. And if you didn't get a chance to have your questions answered, feel free to shoot us a message. There's a contact form on our website or through social media. Thank you all. Have a good night.